Hey folks, welcome to another video about, well, loosely about Worldographer, but mostly about fantasy map making geography. And we're going to use Worldographer for this, but there's nothing stopping you from doing so with any other tool or paper. So to get started, we're just going to go to New World Kingdom Map, and I'm just going to take the default here. This is a 200 by 100 hex map. That it generated with the settings that I last had set here. Hit generate, and pretty within moments we have a version of that map. I'm going to turn off the grid, the numbers of the grid, just so it's a little bit easier to see, and we can use this the mini map up here to pan around a little bit. But sticking to the main topic of geography for making your fantasy world map, I think first I should thank Richard Baker with the World Builder's Guidebook, where I'm getting a lot of these notes from. And we did a lot of research as we were creating Worldographer to do that generator that you just saw. The first thing to think about, and this isn't really mentioned or shown in Worldographer itself, is what scale do you want to do for your world? How big is your world, and what's the shape and size of the world? Most worlds are going to be sphere shaped, like what we've got, but you've got a fantasy world, so you can do something like Ring World, Larry Niven's book series, where you've got the world on a ring. You can do something like Hollow Earth, the D&D setting from, I think, the late 80s, if I remember right. And you can do die-shaped worlds, like a D10, D12, D20. The D20 is particularly interesting because you can do that in Worldographer with the icosahedral projection, which is available on that initial setup screen for creating a new map. You can even do a Mobius strip or a flat map. You can make the flat earthers right because you're in charge of making your fantasy world. So you could do that. But we're going to stick with a sphere-shaped world, but with a flat projection that you're seeing here. And then the second thing to think about overall is the size of your world. The Earth, if you remember, is 24,901 miles around at the equator, and you can go smaller or larger depending on how big of a canvas do you want to have for your world. How much room do you want? But again, the scale, can change, can be a little shifty, especially when you consider that the scale at the equator is different from the scale further north or south away towards the poles. So you can kind of, if you decide, you can enlarge your map kind of in a way. You can say, well, hey, there's a whole other continent over there, and you can, so yeah, you've got a lot of options for expanding your map. But you also can just take a region that is mapped out. Like I can go over to this area here, and I can say, hey, there's a forgotten continent there, or there's some magical event that happened that caused a continent to rise up. We have Atlantis re-rising, for example, and I can do something down there. Or it just could be that the explorers that went in that direction never saw it because they didn't go southwest from this other, from the main landmass. They kind of went due west up here or due south here around, but they never went in this region, and they missed something down here, for example. But the other thing to remember is you don't have to flesh out the whole world at once. Now, Worldographer has a lot of tools to let you do that and to help you do that. For example, I can go in to generate nations and empires, and I can have it just drop down any number of nations and empires that I want, and it will randomly generate all that, and within moments you can see it all appear. I'm going to undo it because we're not trying to use that, but you have that skeleton, that skeleton to work from, and then you can change it and revise it as you want. But usually you're going to want to focus in on one particular starting campaign area like we did, and I'll link to it. We did a video a couple weeks back on starting your local campaign area, and we picked a swampy area next to a mountainous area because that fit the concept of that campaign that we were thinking about doing. So yeah, so once you've got that area, that's where you're going to really focus in on these topics. But you do want to get the broad brush strokes out there. If you because you want to give the players a sense of what the world is. You want to give them that option. Hey, if that character's background comes from a far off land, well, let's have some of that done. Let's have some just a few bullet points, and a location and general terrain for that area. And so you can do that with this. So with your map, you're really going to start with your coastlines. And what Worldographer does is it puts down a number of land masses, and where they overlap is kind of where it starts building up your mountains and hills. And so it just keeps on putting down, maybe it's somewhat random. It could be 10 by 10, 15 by 15, 18 by 25, whatever hex regions. And it just keeps on dropping them on top of each other to build up these mountain ranges until we kind of get to a land frequency that the user set on those initial settings, or land percentage, like what percentage of the map. And I think we said here that we wanted about 40% of the map to be land. So that's what we got. And also mountain percentage. So then it also will grow. You get some mountains as part of that, but then you can get more mountains, and it will try to find areas to kind of connect some mountains together into mountain ranges. So yeah, talking a little bit more about mountains, though. Mountains are going to, when you're designing your world from scratch, if you're not using a tool, or if you're refining what the tool came up with, you're going to want to keep in mind that your mountain ranges run oftentimes parallel to your coastlines, because that's how the plate tectonics work. You also might have some that are being formed by volcanoes, and that's where they could be in clumps, kind of, where you might have an intense pressure under the surface that's getting released by several spigots. And you might have some that are formed in lines, like as the plates move across a particular spigot over time, you get several in sort of a line or curve. Another main terrain type related to the mountains is your hills. You can have foothills that are kind of rugged hills that are surrounding mountains. So that would be a lot of these things here. You're also going to have some high... and they can be less rugged if erosion has had some time to work too. So then that leads into rolling hills and tablelands, and these are the hills that are kind of more eroded away, and possibly now also cultivated. So we can have some of these forested hills here and so forth. Let's see. Depressions is another thing that you're not seeing here on this map. We would do that by putting in some sort of an elevation line to show maybe a depression to a particular area, or those depressions oftentimes they'll form swamps and marshes, and even inland seas, which we'll get to a little bit more about inland seas in a minute. So then we've got gorges, which are steep passes and valleys formed by river canyons, and escarpments, which are sudden changes in elevation. Think of it kind of like, at the edge of a plateau, we might have some significant elevation drop-off. So that's covering your main landforms. Next, we want to apply climate to it, and we want to think about what your planet is like. What's the climate there? And start with, because it's easiest, and we know Earth. Think about what Earth is like, and think, do you want a planet that's similar to that, or do you want something that's more arid overall, more humid overall? That's one factor. And then the other factor to consider is it hotter or colder? So, if you are sticking with an Earth-like world, you're going to have, that's sort of where we're going for here, is because we've got our icy regions near the poles, and we've got some of these evergreen mountains here. But then as we drift into the equator area, we've got our tropical forest here in some places. And then further back down to our South Pole, then we get back to having the icy regions. So you've got an Arctic climate at the poles, subarctic, temperate, subtropical, and then finally tropical near the equator. Now, on a hotter world, you could drop, some of those that are further away and move those, up or rather away from the equator, and put in something at the equator that maybe is just unbearable. Maybe only certain creatures can live near the equator because the climate is so difficult, or maybe people have adapted. Maybe there's some groups that have adapted to that. There could also be that you've got some magic or fantasy or science fiction devices, if you're using this for a science fiction world, that allow people to live in those regions. And then likewise, or reversing that, you can also have a much hotter world where you make, a much colder world where you make the poles even more intolerable, or further south is inhospitable, and people can only live near the equator, or maybe only up to 40 degrees north is kind of what it's like for us at 70 degrees north, for example. So you want to think about that, and that would impact how far you bring this iciness down. How far down do you bring or up do you bring the evergreen mountains in the tropical? And in Wildographer, we allow you to kind of specify that. And if I pull up the dialogue again with this iciness and how far do you want that to go? If you went to 100%, well then your whole world is going to be icy, and you're only going to have a little bit of evergreen. If you do have vegetation, you're only going to have a little bit of it near the middle. So that's your climate. And then related to climate, then we also have to think about the wind patterns. And this was new to me until I started doing worldographer and so forth. Is a little bit of a meteorology lesson. Is that our wind patterns are driven by high and low pressure cells over the oceans, and to a lesser degree over land. And then in the northern hemisphere, they tend to go clockwise, and in the southern hemisphere, they tend to go counterclockwise. So we might have something like, so down here, over this huge landmass out here, you might have something that's going, since this is mostly in the southern hemisphere, you might have something that's kind of brushing up this way, like this. So you might have your moisture coming up like this, and maybe it's going out that way, and then, the northern, it's coming down like this. I'm sorry. Yeah. No, yeah, it's going to be going so clockwise in the northern, counterclockwise in the southern. So you might have a lot of wind going this way, right? Same thing here. You're going to have going like this, counterclockwise in the southern, and then clockwise in the northern. So you're going to have the wind going from east to west around the equator. Right. So that's the gist of what I'm seeing and how I would be planning this out. And so when I think about that, you might want to add some red and blue arrows to your map to note all of that. And then you can have how do your mountain ranges impact that? Your mountain ranges are going to cause that air to lose moisture. So I might look at that, what we had just said, and I might change this terrain here, and I might let me narrow the terrain choices down here so it's a little bit easier to find what I want. But I might be putting in more grassland here, or having more of these these forested hills might get mostly non-forested, and I might get some heavy forest in front of it and some forested hills. Okay, yeah, like here. And so I might get these forested hills. So these ones here might be forested. So I'm going to be thinking about that, those wind patterns, and how does that impact things. Now, your very high mountains, that can divert the wind around it, but that's much more limited. And then you're going to have arid regions, so this area, yeah, well, I think I already said about how, yeah, so we were changing some of this terrain to be more barren. And eventually I'm going to have the grasslands. And then eventually further out, I'm going to have some forested lands. So, although Worldographer is giving me a good start, it's something where I'm going to think about those wind patterns and be adjusting it. Now, going forward, maybe in a few months, maybe you'll see an update to the Worldographer world generation algorithm that takes this into account. But for the moment, this is something that you would be tweaking on your own. Next up, let's talk about other forms of water, our inland seas and lakes and rivers. So our inland seas, we already mentioned these real briefly, that these are formed, like, for example, here. And this might be a pretty good example, although I probably would drop that desert area from there, although you could say it's some sort of a beach-like thing. But for our purposes, I might take this as an inland sea here, right? So that's just where the land happens to be lower than sea level in that particular region. And that's caused by, there's rains and rivers that are flowing to bring in the water, but that's the lowest land. So there's nowhere for it to go other than to possibly evaporate. So if it does, you might have a salt lake where it's evaporating regularly and you get some salt in that salty water from the minerals left behind, or you could have salt flats where if the lake evaporates completely, either seasonal or just over long-term climate, so you might have some salt flats left behind because of that. So lakes, on the other hand, do have the rivers flowing in and out, and Worldographer does have a bit of a generator for just placing a number of rivers, and you can specify how many do you want to have in there. So I can pick any number, and it's going to find mountain, and it's going to lead down to hills, and then down to flatter lands, to the marsh, going out to there. So you got that, and if we wanted to be complete, we typically with Worldographer will change the coast to this sea color. But it does that for, and here we go into an inland sea. Now here, we could have another river, for example. I can go to shapes and I can select this shape, for example. And that just helps me get all the settings correct easily. And so I can have, this river coming down into this inland sea. And then I can change the color of that sea as well. So you have the rivers leading into your lakes or an inland sea, and for a river, then for a lake, the rivers are going to also lead out of that. So you've got it going kind of two ways, and that's where the rivers are being formed, either through glacial melt, if there might be a river up at the top of the mountains, for example, or on the way, and then. It could also be formed by places where it's just naturally slow, where the ground is more level, and it just kind of flows out into a lake and then continues on. You might have several rivers leading in, and maybe even one or two leading out. So that's your lakes. And rivers, like I was saying, they're going to flow downhill. That's the important thing. So that's why, like I said, pointed out that the algorithm here does go from mountains to hills and down. Now occasionally in Worldographer you'll see that it doesn't look like it's fully honoring that, but because there's some possible variance in the levels of the terrain, occasionally you might have some particularly high hills and particularly low mountains, and so it might not seem like it's going downhill, but if you look in, you can pull up the detailed information for that particular hex, and you would see that it is running downhill. Rivers can also then form your gorges and valleys through erosion, so that they go cutting through, the lands. So that's our rivers. Then talking about the remaining terrain, so like I said, we have some vegetation that will be developing where there's adequate water from the rivers and from the moist air. So we already talked about this and turning this into more wooded land here. So since we added this, maybe I would also throw in some forested hexes here, and say that some of these are forested. Um, so, um, and then likewise, almost lost my train of thought, but I got it. You can add in some heavy forest. If I'm expanding that forest just for variety, so it looks good. We already had some heavy forest in here, but just so that it looks good, you can throw in some heavy forest to kind of vary that terrain. I could also make some of it mixed forest, especially as I get further away from the equator. If I come up here, we've got some evergreen up here, and we've got some deciduous forest, but I can throw in some mixed forest if I want to as well. That just adds some variety to things. Swamps and marshes, well, we've seen some, so Worldographer does put down some random swamps as you're going along. Of course, next to a coast of some type or another. And so as you're changing terrain, changing some of it to swamp where appropriate. If that river is flowing through there, well, there's a chance that that river is particularly slow and widens out a bit, and you've got some swamp area. Then also keep in mind that, like I was saying a moment ago, climate can affect this. So you can have some of these evergreen trees. We're going to make some mixed forest trees, but even in a tropical region, you might have some mountains that are particularly high, and so if they've got vegetation, you might have some evergreen forest up there, or deciduous forest, even though you're in a tropical forest otherwise. So all of, it's kind of an iterative effect where you're making some changes and then you see something else that should change as a relation to it. Next point is, keep in mind that you're making a fantasy map, so you can break any of these rules if you really want to. And sometimes it's a good thing to do that. It's good to keep people remembering, hey, I'm looking at a fantasy world. Maybe the wizards have created some lush paradise off in the desert there for some reason. They've been ostracized and they've found it a place to live, and it's in the middle of the desert, but because of magic, they can make it a paradise. You might also have, as in Dragonlance, you can have some gods dropping a mountain down and changing the landscape of a region. So, you can also, though, use magic to explain a mistake. If you don't have your rivers running downhill. Oh, that points out another thing with rivers that I forgot a moment ago, is that your rivers, your mountains are going to form a divide. For example, that was maybe not the best example. Well, if I change up the terrain here a little bit, and if we added in some more mountains in the center of this, right? So we've got this river flowing down here. Well, I can, if I'm going to add another river, and it starts here, I'm going to have them going out this way, and so the rivers here on this side of the mountain will join together. And the rivers on the other side of the mountain would join together, but you're not going to have them meet or cross or anything. They're going to be kept separate. They're going to be separate river networks caused by a divide caused by the mountains. So, glad I remembered that. Building a fantasy world is a really fun creative exercise. But you don't have to do it all at once. Like I said, we'll link to the video about detailing a particular campaign area. But once if I focused in on this area and dealt with all of the details of the wind currents and how that affects the vegetation here, I don't necessarily have to go and revise all of this. I can wait on that, and I can detail that later. I just need to have some of the broad strokes. Maybe I do one iteration of revising the land over there, but I don't bother with, doing it 5 times over. Whereas over here, maybe I do look at it 5 times over. And then I'm going to put in my kingdoms, which we would do via the shapes tool or the random generator. And we've got the features drawer as well, which is where we put all of our features drawer has all of our, let's filter it by classic. but it has all of our specialty buildings and so forth here, or settlements, castles, that sort of thing, and the shapes drawers where we draw our lines and so forth. So I think that gives you a very quick but pretty good crash course in Geography 101 for fantasy world mapping. I really hope, regardless of what tool you use, even though we make Worldographer and we think it's a great thing, if you're using paper or some other program, I think that keeping these things in mind will really help your map be a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not accurate, but a little bit more realistic. But again, as I said, you can make it fantastic too. Thanks a bunch.